Groups function best and move from stage to stage when advanced group issues are managed, and we've looked at what those are in our prior video lecture, and when problem group behaviors are also managed. And in this video lecture, we're going to learn about problem behaviors that, as the leader, it's important for us to manage to effectively lead groups. The first is monopolizing. Monopolizing occurs when a group member has a need for attention, approval, and a discomfort with silence. And that can lead to them becoming very vocal in the group to the extent that they become domineering, and other group members don't have the space that they need to work through issues and to explore and disclose their own thoughts and feelings about what's happening in the group. Now, the best way to interrupt this when a member is monopolizing is to confront the group as a whole about how they have allowed one member to carry the meeting. That's a good way of initiating group process and helping the group to manage itself versus you having to manage the monopolizing group member. Now, it's also important, of course, to talk with the group member who's monopolizing. And the way that we would encourage them to change the behavior is to ask them to focus on the here and now of what's happening in the group, because often the person is unaware that they're taking up the meeting and they aren't necessarily reflecting on interactions within the group situation. They are more, if they're monopolizing, talking about the there and then, their past history, and bringing that into the group situation. Next, we have what I consider moralizing. Sometimes this is thought of as preachy, advice giving, pushing an agenda. It shuts down interpersonal contact and irritates members. We don't feel closer to people who are trying to convince us to a certain way of thinking. Okay? Instead, we feel somewhat controlled or perhaps even judged. So the way in which we interrupt this process is asking that member to share self-experience, what it's like to be in the group today, what it's like to hear certain things, rather than whether or not a person should have done this or that. All right, moving on. Psychosis or mania is also something to pay close attention to. Unless the person is extremely well managed and does not have a severe case of psychosis like schizophrenia, they're probably going to be a better candidate for structured psychoeducational groups than process groups. Because if decompensation occurs too early in a process group, it can destabilize and frighten members, and in a psychoeducational group, it wouldn't necessarily be as problematic. Okay? I'll also add that again, I've mentioned this in other video lectures, that if you have a person with schizophrenia in a process group, they're liable to develop symptoms because of how emotionally rich and high expressed the emotion level is in the group, and that can cause the member to actually become more symptomatic. And so it's a consideration for perhaps not having them in certain types of groups. Okay? I'm going to talk about silence next. Let's begin with the importance of inclusion and including members who are more, I would say, on the periphery. Vicarious observation rarely leads to a positive and productive outcome. So as much as a person may be comfortable with observing, they're not going to have as much learning and improvement as if they're more engaged in the process, because they aren't receiving feedback about how they show up in group. I'll also add here that, as Yalom says, silence is never silent in the here and now, meaning in a process group, when a person is silent, we pay attention to when they're silent, we pay attention to the people they're silent in response to, and what they're thinking when they're silent. And often silence is a behavior and can tell us a lot about how the person interacts with the group and with people outside of the group in their personal life. So, to some degree, we want each member to self-disclose because, again, feedback via reality testing is critical. And we would do this by drawing out the person, by commenting on their nonverbal participation, by asking process questions like, how did you feel when the group put you on the spot? What's it like for you when that the group wants you to be included in the conversation? All of those questions help members on the periphery to become more involved in the group. I'm going to move on next to personality disorders. Schizoid personality is marked by a person who's emotionally blocked and non-reflective, somewhat isolative. In Yalom's words, they do not experience their own experience. Often people with schizoid personality are the kind of adult version of a child with reactive attachment disorder, whereby they have no attachments or connection with others in their life. They can't remember early parts of their childhood. They can't identify how they're feeling. Because of this emotional numbness and isolation from others, lack of connection with others, change can be slow, steady, somewhat plodding. We're going to look next at borderline personality disorder. This is quite a famous diagnosis now. It didn't used to be as famous 20 years ago. Borderline personality is marked by instability, emotional instability in particular, reactivity, so a person may, for example, develop a kind of unpredictable rage spells, become self-injurious under stress. They have a sense of emptiness. They don't have a coherent sense of who they are outside of their interactions with other people. They feel somewhat fragile then because their self-concept vacillates and changes like a chameleon among who they're around. Now, with a person with borderline personality, concurrent individual and group work is actually the best course of action. Individual work alone is not effective because each session tends to be crisis management focused. And group work as an adjunct is useful because the person can learn skills to manage crisis a bit better. I will add that Yalom actually suggests that some members of with borderline personality disorder in a group can actually be facilitative because they often have quite a high awareness of their emotional life and they're able to display emotions in the group. And that can be facilitative. But again, the group cannot handle more than a couple of members with borderline personality because it'll be too volatile. Next, we have narcissistic personality. Now, narcissistic personality is perhaps best treated in groups because the person needs interpersonal feedback on their own relational style and they'll tend to discount it from the therapist. People with narcissistic personality tend to revel and really thrive in interpersonal attention, and they seek out attention. They indeed judge the group by the amount of session time allotted to them. And that in itself is a bit problematic, right? Because therapy in itself is reinforcing rather than therapy being a change mechanism. So that concludes this video lecture on problem group behaviors that can occur in different types of groups and how you would best manage them and work through them as the group leader.